All right, well, welcome to our third lecture, and this lecture tonight is going to be on progressive presidents. We're in the progressive era, and today we're going to look at three progressive presidents. And by the time you watch this, we will probably have covered two of these. Really not going to spend a whole lot of time on President Taft, just on Roosevelt and Wilson. So hopefully this will supplement what we've done in class. So let's go ahead and get started here. We're going to look at three presidents, and all three of these presidents serving from 1901 to 1921 are considered progressive presidents. And hopefully by the end of this PowerPoint and from what we've done in class, you'll be able to understand why they're considered progressive presidents. So we're going to look at Teddy Roosevelt, who served 2 terms, William Howard Taft, who served 1 term, and then, of course, President Wilson, who's going to serve also 2 terms. We'll also look at the election of 1912, which is a pretty interesting election. All right, so let's talk about how Teddy Roosevelt became president. Teddy Roosevelt was actually the vice president of William McKinley, and McKinley was in his second term when he was at a speaking engagement in Buffalo, New York, and he was shot and killed by an assassin. Now, this assassin was an anarchist and a socialist, and after he shot the president, this is the quote that you see here, he said, "I killed the president because he was the enemy of the good people, the good working people. I am not sorry for my crime." The assassin was a Polish immigrant. He had grew up in Detroit. He actually worked as a child laborer in a steel mill, and so had worked his whole life and kind of gravitated towards socialism and anarchism when he got older. And he killed McKinley, claimed he killed McKinley because McKinley was the head of what he thought was a corrupt government. And so we look at this conflict between workers, between labor, and the government in big business. And most people thought that the government and big business were in this thing together, and the people were being left out. So when Roosevelt became president, he was McKinley's vice president. And when he became president, this is what the political landscape looked like in America. And we've talked about a lot of this stuff already in class. And as we go through the lecture, a lot of these things will be addressed. How did Roosevelt address these? So let's look at the first one here, government versus trust. Hopefully you understand that. We had the government versus the big trusts like Rockefeller and Carnegie. And then you have labor versus capital. Labor obviously being workers, capital obviously being people with money, big business. And then we have conservation versus development. Conservation that means conserving something, and in this case it was conserving the environment, versus development. Again, big businesses wanted to develop areas in the United States, and they did not care about destroying the environment. And then, of course, you had wealth versus commonwealth. Wealth, again, referring to people who had a lot of money or just money in general, and how that's made in America. And then the commonwealth, or the good of the people. And then the last one here is nativism versus the golden door. And we talked about this when we touched on immigration. Do we restrict immigrants, or do we have this golden door and let everybody come in who wants to come to America? So these are some of the things that Roosevelt is going to have to address while he's president. All right, so let's talk about Teddy Roosevelt and his square deal. And again, I think most of you are probably watching this on the weekend before your quiz Monday, so we've already talked about the square deal in class, so let's just give you a quick reminder here. The square deal, and what that term really means, is Roosevelt wanted to give everybody a square deal, or he wanted everything to be fair. I guess is another word to look at, is a fair deal. And so there were 3 things that he wanted to do. Number 1, he wanted to control corporations. He wanted to make sure that these big businesses and corporations were not more powerful than the government in taking advantage of the people, which leads us into 2, consumer protection. He wanted to protect the consumer, protect the American people, and we're going to see how he's going to do that here in just a few minutes. And then third, the conservation of natural resources. He is going to be the first president to actually care about the environment and protect the environment from business. Okay. Just some fun facts about Teddy Roosevelt. He's the youngest president ever at age 42, and remember, he was not elected, so he was not the youngest president elected. The youngest president elected was Kennedy, but remember, he was not elected. He assumed the presidency when McKinley was assassinated. He's going to be known as a modern president, mainly because he was so young. I think people could relate to him better than an old guy. And he could he could influence the media and shape legislation. A lot of that had to do with his personality, and we'll talk about that as the lecture goes on. Notice he's in a picture here with a teddy bear. Actually, the teddy bear got its name after Teddy Roosevelt. The story apparently goes that he was on a hunting trip with some friends, and they were bear hunting, and there was a bear cub who had been separated from his mother, and they wanted to shoot it, and Roosevelt wouldn't let them shoot the cub, and so they kind of, were kidding around with him and started calling him Teddy Bear. And when the story kind of came out, there was a toy company who created this bear and sent it to Roosevelt, and that was the first teddy bear. And I think still today it's the most marketed stuffed animal in the history of the country, and that's how it got its name, Teddy Roosevelt. All right, so let's talk about control of corporations. Remember, if we go back and look here, that is number one. So what's Roosevelt going to do? Here's your question. Make sure you write this down. What did Roosevelt do to balance the government versus trust? Or we could say labor versus capital. We'll look at both here. Because remember, he did not want big business to be more powerful than the government, and as you know, at one time in the Gilded Age it was. So here's some of the things that he's going to do to fight back. Number one, he's going to use the Sherman Antitrust Act against the Standard Oil Company and against other trusts. He's going to be known as a trust buster. Another really big thing that happened was the anthracite coal strike. And you guys read about this, and you saw it in the video that we watched in class. But workers, coal miners were wanting higher pay. They wanted a pay increase, so they went on strike. Well, this caused a problem in the country because coal prices went up. People weren't working. They weren't producing coal, so the price of this went up. So Roosevelt had to get involved because coal was how people heated their homes. It ran America as it does today. So Roosevelt arbitrates, or he stands in and tries to make a deal between the unions and the business owners, and the unions agreed to his deal, but the owners refused. Well, this made Roosevelt really angry, and he threatened to have the army to come in and run the mines and kind of leave the owners out. Well, the owners did not like this idea, so they eventually gave in to Roosevelt's deal. And then we have the Elkins Act and the Hepburn Act, which were very similar. The Elkins Act is just going to further prohibit discriminatory railroad rates, and the Hepburn Act is going to strengthen the Interstate Commerce Act, which again regulates trade and regulates those railroad rates to make sure they're not ripping off the people. All right, so let's talk about trust, because Teddy Roosevelt did not hate all trust. He did not hate big business. He thought that business was good, capitalism was good, but he drew a fine line between what he considered a good trust and a bad trust. And if you look at the political cartoon here, this is a kind of a play on that. You notice he has killed the bad trusts, okay? And if you look at the good trust, he has what looks to be a leash around the good trust with the word restraint. So he wanted to restrain or to watch over and make sure that the trusts, in his terms, the good trusts, were not taking over and becoming too powerful. So here's what he wanted to do with the Good Trust. He wanted to consolidate industries. That's okay. Be internationally competitive. Again, he liked competition. He liked capitalism. He thought that that was good for America, good for the economy. But what he considered a good trust, yes, we have competition, but we need to offer good prices. Okay. Bad trusts, on the other hand, just the opposite. They reduce competition, push everybody else out, and they drive up prices. So these are the bad trusts that he wanted to do away with. Okay. All right. All right, so next thing is protecting the consumers. If we go back and look, number 3 was consumer protection, and we talked about this a little bit in class the other day, but I wanted to look at these again and maybe elaborate on some things. The Pure Food and Drug Act. Drugs like cocaine and heroin and cannabis, other drugs, similar drugs, morphine, were sold at this time. And what companies would do is they would mislead the public or put secret ingredients or not call them by their names. And we talked about Coca-Cola, and some of you were very surprised that Coca-Cola actually contained cocaine originally. And if you look at this poster here, I think this is kind of funny. Tired? Question mark. Then drink Coca-Cola. It relieves exhaustion, because at the time it had small amounts of cocaine, so it's going to give you that little pep that you need to make it through the day. If you look down here, this is a advertisement for cocaine tooth drops. And again, look at the literature here. Instantaneous cure. It's instantaneous cure because you're high on cocaine and you're not thinking about your toothache anymore. So this was a problem. And so in response to this, all these unregulated claims and unhealthy products, Congress is going to pass the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. And here's what it did. It's going to stop the sale of contaminated foods and medicines and call for, and here's what I underline here is what's important, the truth in labeling. They had to label what was in that product, okay, and this is medicine and food. And if they didn't, the companies would be fined. That's why still today you have, if you go to the grocery store and you look, all of those foods have labels. So again, protecting the consumer. And the next one is the Meat Inspection Act. We talked about this one as well. This was the inspection of meat, as you can see in the picture here. So the meat had to be slaughtered and processed under sanitary conditions. And remember what book prompted this legislation? Hopefully you remember it was The Jungle, written by Upton Sinclair. Okay, so again, protecting the consumer. All right, so the next one is the environment, Roosevelt and the environment. Before Roosevelt became president, really the government did not care about the environment or natural resources, because we had so many, especially in the West, and the government really didn't care about that. They cared more about business and the economy than they did the environment. But at this time, when Roosevelt became president, he realized that conservation is going to be a big issue in his administration. He wanted to protect the environment because big business was going wild, destroying the environment. And he was an outdoorsman. He was a hunter and a fisherman, and he loved the outdoors. He'd grown up being outdoors a lot, and he wanted to maintain this and make sure that big business did not ruin these beautiful places in the West that he wanted to keep for generation to generation. And here's what he did, some specifics here. He's going to set aside 148 million acres of forest reserves, most of these being in the West, as well as 1.5 million acres of water power sites. Those would be dams. 50 wildlife sanctuaries and national parks, one of them being, of course, Yellowstone National Park. There's quite a few. I'll show you a map here in just a second to show you some of these places that are national parks today. Some of them Roosevelt helped to establish. Okay, so here's a map. You can see most of these are in the West. You have the Redwood Forest here. Of course, you have Yellowstone, the Grand Tetons, and many, many, Death Valley, many of these being in California, but these are all protected by the U.S. government. A couple down in Texas, Big Bend. Some of you may have been there, Guadalupe Mountains here. All right, we already watched that. Okay, so we're going to talk very, very briefly about President Taft. So Roosevelt serves his 2 terms, and this is before the amendment that stopped presidents from serving 2 terms, so he probably could have served a 3, but he didn't. He left and he got out of politics, and he kind of groomed his vice president, William Taft, to become president. So Taft, again, the Republican, defeats William Jennings Bryan. You should remember him. He was the populist president in 1908. Really, the only thing that you need to know about Taft is he is going to continue to fight big business, and he's going to bust trusts. He busted 90 trusts during his 4 years in office. We don't really need to know all the details about Taft. Taft lost popularity with the American people because he was doing some things that his constituents did not like, so he's going to end up not getting reelected. Really, a little bit about Taft. He was the heaviest president or the fattest president. You've probably heard the story about him getting stuck in the bathtub. I don't know if it's true or not, but that's the story about Taft. He really didn't like being president. He called it the lonesomest job in the world. What he really liked is law, and he actually became a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court after and he's the only president to serve as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Harding is going to nominate him in 1921. Okay. So in the 1912 election, you're going to have, it's very interesting what happened. Republicans are going to be split in 1912 because Teddy Roosevelt is going to come back, and he's going to want to run again for a 3rd term as a Republican. Well, Taft was already the nominee, and so you had this fight in the Republican Party between Taft and Teddy Roosevelt. Who are we going to pick, Taft or Roosevelt? Well, we're split. And the convention delegates are going to nominate Taft. So Taft is going to be the Republican nomination. Well, this made a lot of Republicans mad, and Roosevelt is going to form a 3rd party. And he called it the Bull Moose Party or the Progressive Party. And of course, Roosevelt's going to be nominated for this. So the Republican Party is going to be split. At any time a major political party is split, it's happened before in history, the other party is always going to win. The Democrats are going to put forward Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, and then Eugene Debs for the Socialist Party actually gets about 1 million votes, which is pretty good for a 3rd party and for a socialist. So you probably know what's going to happen. As you can see from the map here, Wilson is going to win in a pretty big landslide, 82% of the electoral vote. But look at the Republicans. Okay, it was split 27.5 and 23. So who would have won if the Republican Party wouldn't have split? Well, most likely the Republican would have. But because they split, Wilson, the Democrat, is going to win the election. So let's talk about, well, these are your results here. Wilson's going to win, and the Democrats now are going to dominate the national government. First time since the Civil War. So the South's going to have the White House, and they're going to be the majority in Congress. So Southerners are back in power. And I know this is a long time after the Civil War, but it took that long for Southerners to come back into power. So, and again, why did he win the election in 1912? We all know this, because the Republican Party was split. And you probably know Wilson as a president who led us through World War I, but the next unit will talk more about foreign policy. This unit's more about domestic policy. So let's talk about what Wilson did domestically. Wilson, just like Teddy Roosevelt, his I guess his program, his platform is going to be the New Freedom, and I'm pretty sure you did your flashcard. You had a flashcard on the New Freedom and on the Square Deal, and also maybe you're a little bit confused by that. So let's go ahead and talk about the New Freedom. He's going to do something very similar to what Teddy Roosevelt did. He's going to attack what he calls the triple wall of privilege. And so you have trusts, okay, big business. He's going to want to lower tariffs, and remember, if you remember tariffs from 8th grade, I don't think we've talked about that in class yet. Tariff is a tax on imported goods, and it benefits businesses, okay? Because when these goods come into the country, if there's a tariff, foreign goods, I should say, come into the country, there's a tariff which makes the foreign good more, which means the domestic good is going to be cheaper. So Americans will buy the domestic good. Well, the problem with that is if you have really high tariffs, those foreign goods are going to be very expensive. The domestic good, now they can lower just a little bit under that high price for the foreign good and still make a pretty good profit. So he's going to want to bust trusts, lower tariffs to help the economy, and of course he wants to regulate big businesses, and what he's really going to be known for is reforming or changing the banking industry. So let's talk about that. One of the things that he's going to create is the Federal Trade Commission, which is still around today. And this is essentially a watchdog agency. Watchdog means they're going to be watching, making sure nothing bad goes on. To end unfair business practices. And we know that this was one of the problems of the Gilded Age, or these unfair business practices. So the Federal Trade Commission is going to protect the American people essentially from business. And one of the big things they do today is protect consumers from identification theft. And this is something that's big today, is ID theft. Okay. All right, the big one here, Federal Reserve System, 1913. So the Federal Reserve System, he's going to change the way banking works in the United States. And before the Federal Reserve was founded, the country had a lot of financial crisis. It was just time and time again, these financial crises, and they led to what's called in history, they call panics. And in these panics, it's a time when the economy is not good and people go to the bank and withdraw their money. Well, the problem with that is if enough people withdraw their money, the bank fails. Okay? And the failure of one bank leads to, a lot of times, this domino effect in which customers freak out and they go to other banks and pull their money out of there. And so you have all these banks that start failing. And so banks needed this source of emergency reserves to prevent the panics and the resulting runs from driving them out of business, so these banks wouldn't close down. So what happened is in 1913, Congress is going to pass the Federal Reserve Act, and essentially what it did is it created it was created to address these banking panics, and it has these responsibilities with making sure that there's a sound banking system in America and a healthy economy. So you could say that it's government supervision of the banking system to keep these banks from failing, and they would loan them. One of the things they do is they loan them Federal Reserve notes, so they loan them this type of currency in an emergency, so they don't fail. Okay, so changing the banking system. All right, and the last thing here is another antitrust act that's going to be passed. It's called the Clayton Antitrust Act. This is going to kind of back up or strengthen the Sherman Antitrust Act, which we talked about in class had some problems. So just know the Clayton Antitrust Act was a supporter or kind of beefed up the Sherman Antitrust Act by outlawing these corporations' trusts. Okay? And that is going to be it. We're going to stop there.